We've got three speakers from the Nelson Nash Institute, which is the official home of becoming your own banker and the infinite banking concept. First speaker that we're going to have up here today is Dr. Robert P. Murphy. Bob Murphy has a PhD in economics from New York University. After teaching for 3 years at Hillsdale College, Dr. Murphy left academia for the financial sector, where he worked on portfolio management and economic research at Laffer Associates. Dr. Murphy now is president of Consulting by RPM and runs the popular economics blog Free Advice at consultingbyrpm.com. Dr. Murphy has testified before Congress and has given numerous interviews on TV and radio. He is the author of hundreds of articles and several books on economic topics aimed at the layperson, so all of us, including the Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, written in 2007, How Privatized Banking Really Works, written in 2010 with Carlos Lara, who's also going to speak today, and Lessons for the Young Economist, written in 2010. Dr. Murphy is a research fellow at the Independent Institute and is the senior economist for the Institute for Energy Research, where he specializes in economics of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Robert P. Murphy.
Okay. Thanks, John. Thanks for that kind introduction. Just to take a note from Mark Benson's presentation style, if I say anything and you guys write it down, next to it put very, very important. Okay, just want to make sure, I don't want there to be any ambiguity here. Okay, so I know some of you know us very well, but some of you don't know us at all, and so we're kind of constrained here. We don't want to leave anybody behind. We also have time constraints, so what we're going to give you here is, especially Carlos and I are going to be very limited in terms of the time we normally take, so we're just going to try to give you a flavor. We wanted to leave as much time as possible for Nelson to fully flesh out his details. He's going to be, Nelson, are you hanging up the microphone next November? Is that the official date?
I will not do any speaking engagements outside of Birmingham by after Thanksgiving of next year.
Right. Okay. So that's why, since his time is expiring, that's why we wanted to let him speak as long as possible today. So I'm just going to give you some scattershot things just to give you an idea of who we are, and then at the end I'm going to just again reinforce why are we here at this particular conference, what's our relationship with E3 and so forth. Okay, so John did a good job of summarizing who I am, but partly because of my narcissism, let me just make sure you know who I am, because it does tie into the message, my role in this three-part presentation. So I got my PhD in economics at NYU. I was, in my mind, just going to be an academic. I taught initially at Hillsdale College. Now, just in August, I'm at Texas Tech, actually. So for those of you in Texas, if you want to come talk to me about that. Then I spent some time, I had been in Nashville for several years, and what took me there is I was interviewing for the financial sector, and Arthur Laffer of Laffer Curve fame, he was in New York interviewing people and hired me, and he was just moving out of California to Nashville, primarily for tax purposes, because he was getting sick of the checks he was writing to the California government. I've testified before Congress. My disclaimer is they don't listen to anything I say, so you can't hold me responsible for anything Congress does. I was going around with what's called the Mises Institute, named after a famous Austrian economist, and you'll learn more about that. Carlos is going to talk a lot about Austrian economics in his talk, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it's a school of thought. There's the Chicago School of Economics, the Keynesian School, and then there's also what's called the Austrian School. If you followed Ron Paul when he was running for president, that's the kind of stuff he was talking about, that method of thought. A little bit later, I'll give you a specific example of why we're so keen on the Austrian school. But in any event, just so you know where I was coming from, I was doing, before I met Carlos or heard of Nelson Nash, I was on the public circuit going around giving talks to people. Primarily my capacity is being affiliated with the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which is in Auburn, Alabama. Ludwig von Mises was one of the giants in Austrian economics. But the issue there, just to tell you, so make sure I don't forget, is we were basically scaring the crap out of people, especially after the '08 crisis, putting charts up of what Bernanke was doing. And so we could tell everyone what the problem was, but we didn't really have much of a solution except to say we need to educate enough people so finally public opinion can flip, and then we can get better policies coming out of Washington, which I still believe in, and that's ultimately the only long-term solution. But for a crowd hearing that, they knew, well, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And so really all we were doing was driving people to the local taverns, right, or the local bridges, depending on how much they took our message to heart. Because they were going to spray paint "Screw Bernanke," that's why. That wasn't making any... And so that's why I'll fill in the story a little bit more, but that's why I was so glad to hook up with Carlos, who introduced me to Nelson. And that's, I'll talk a little bit about where the Nelson Nash Institute came from. The other thing you should know about me is that I'm known to dabble at the karaoke bar. This actually, I promise this isn't photoshopped. My joke, I had this as my Facebook cover photo for a while, and I said this is the one time when undergrads responded to my message with the enthusiasm it deserved. Because here what happened, this was in Auburn, Alabama. There was this band, Fly By Radio, that they happened to like Austrian economics, and how all those musicians are always talking about Austrian economics. So it's like save the planet, sound money. It's two go hand in hand. And so they saw me at the karaoke bar and said, "Hey, we have a concert here on Friday. Do you want to get up and sing in front of hundreds of people?" And I was like, "You got to ask me? Of course I do." And so about 13 beers later, I'm up there, and this was the part of Twist and Shout when they're doing the music. Dun, 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 dun. And when you're 300 people, you got to sell it. And so that's what I was doing right there. And my favorite part of this photo is, you see this guy? He's trying to talk to her, and she's just looking at me like this. That is my favorite part. And the reason I like that is because when I was in college, I was that guy. So it's like the circle of life. All right. Okay, so as Mark said, and he certainly set us up well to tee this off, to understand IBC, we're going to tell you what it is, but you really need to read this. And let me acknowledge, for some of you with the kind of business, the practice you have, this might not work with some of your clients, right? They might, but you need to read this so you understand, the inventor of this concept, how he was thinking of it. And also, let me warn you, that it might not click at first, right? And I think, and that's what happened with me. I know it's happened with Carlos. He might talk a little bit about his own personal odyssey with this. What happened is Carlos, I was meeting with Carlos. We both lived in Nashville. He was reading a study guide I had written for a large economics book that was put out by Murray Rothbard, who was in the Austrian school, an economist, because Carlos was trying to understand the business cycle, and he really wanted to understand. So he had done his own research. After what happened in the 80s, he was a business person, a consultant, and he realized, I don't understand how the economy works. How can I be talking to people about their money? How can I make responsible investment decisions myself if all of a sudden huge recessions come and interest rates spike, and I don't even see that coming? This is unacceptable. So he went on his own journey, discovered the Austrian School of Economics, and thought, all right, these guys are the closest to the truth. This sounds real. This has got to be the right part of, or on the road to the solution here, or the explanation. So he contacted me and said, "Hey, I happen to be going through your study guide for this Murray Rothbard book. I'm in Nashville. You want to come meet?" So we did. He handed me this book and said, "Tell me what you think of this when you get a chance." So to be honest, I read it. I liked the value system, if you will. I was like, "Oh, this is a great guy," but some of his statements, they just, I was coming out of academia, NYU, and I had been trying to get a job on Wall Street and so on. So with the way I was thinking, this didn't fit, and I would not have pursued it, just to be honest with you. Except I knew Carlos; he was nobody's fool, and he really believed in this passionately. And so I kept. And it was the way I describe it. It's like the first time I read the book, I thought, okay, this guy's a great guy. It'd be great to have a beer with or something. But there's like 10 things that are just totally wrong with this approach. And then the more I read about it and thought about it, I was like, all right, you know what? There's 8 things that are wrong with this. And over time, they all kept falling away. And then by the end of it, I was like, why isn't everyone doing this? These idiots, And so that's kind of how it was. And so I, again, encourage you to check it out yourself. Okay, and so here's one way another thing I want to say is, when you read it, Nelson wrote this book for the general public, okay? And he had been giving seminars or whatever. So he had done trial and error and figured out, how do I get average people to realize they want to pursue this? And so that's what he's doing in his book, right? He's not trying to convince a Harvard MBA that this actually makes sense to maximize expected portfolio value 10 years from now while minimizing risk or something. That's not what he's trying to do in that book. He's trying to get real people to see, yeah, honey, why aren't we doing this? All right, and so it's very folksy, if you will. I don't know if you get what I'm saying when you go to, I'm just telling people who haven't read it yet. And so, so you might say, oh yes, he's this wise, you definitely trust the guy, he's a good guy for sure. As I started writing more technical pieces, there were certain parts of the book where, there's illustrations, like from life insurance illustrations, and there were certain things like in year 72, why is it doing that? And so I got Nelson on the phone and was going over some of that stuff. And when I hung the phone up and I said to Carlos, I said, wow, Nelson is still really sharp. There's a lot going on behind the scenes of how he picked these examples, to illustrate his point, but he didn't get into all the minutia in the book because this is for the general public. And so now my opinion of Nelson's more like this. Okay, so again, just to give you more of the background, so after Carlos converted me, if you will, he and I wrote this book, and all these books, by the way, if you want to peruse them or ideally buy them, David brought several of them here so you can look at it during the break. And so what we did in this book is sort of married Austrian economics with IBC. IBC's infinite banking concept, that's what Nelson is into. Again, he's going to give you a whole presentation on this. If you really have never heard this before and you're like, what are you guys talking about? Very quickly, it's using, as Mark said, specially designed whole life insurance policies is a cash flow management technique, right? So you're not, yes, you have the death benefit and that's great and that's part of the virtue of it, but the thing is it functions as a way for you to wean yourself from dependence on commercial banks. And especially, it makes sense in any environment, but in terms of what's been happening, especially since 2008, it makes a lot of sense both for business owners and just regular households to use this approach. So what Carlos and I did in this book is we were trying to, there was the IBC community over here who had been inspired by Nelson's book, and then there was the broad Austrian economics fans over here who were against the bailouts and against what Bernanke was doing in terms of inflating the money supply and so on. They didn't believe in all the stuff that the federal government was doing. They wanted to go back to more of a free market economy. So the two groups were perfectly aligned with each other. And like I said, it was more like the Austrians were telling everybody this is the problem, and the fans of Nelson Nash over here had the solution. But typically, the Austrians had never heard of IBC, or if they did, there was like, I don't get this. This is some people trying to sell life insurance. I don't know what this is. And the IBC people knew that Nelson Nash personally was a huge fan of Austrian economics. He had been mentored by Leonard Reed, who founded the Foundation for Economic Education. So Nelson himself was into it, but I think they kind of viewed that as just as like if he was into stamp collecting or something. Like, oh yeah, that's one of Nelson's passions, but we like him for his life insurance stuff, and didn't see the intimate connection. So that's what Carlos and I were trying to do with this, was introduce the two communities together. And we've had progress in that, but it's a slow haul. That really it's hard to get people when they have a paradigm and they've been thinking about something a certain way to realize, look at this, this will really help you achieve what you want. Okay, so let me explain a little bit about the Nelson Nash Institute and why we're here and what we have of particular relevance to this crowd. So the Nelson Nash Institute serves many purposes, but one of the things that we focus on is talking to the general public. And that's really what I personally want to do. I'm not in life insurance. I'm not in sales or anything. What I want to do is explain to the general public, this is why this makes sense, right? Dave Ramsey will tell you why only idiots would buy a whole life policy. Let's walk through and show you why he obviously doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to his particular critique. So that's the role I want to play. And we were doing that, especially when Carlos and my book came out. We were getting invited by insurance professionals from around the country to go out. They would fly us out. They would assemble a crowd of 30, 40 people. And we would get up there and go through our PowerPoints, explain to them what Bernanke was doing, and wow, and then show them, look, if you can sort of secede from this system by implementing infinite banking, by doing one of these policies, or what we were calling privatized banking, to try to get people to see how, you know, it's a private thing. You know, you're not reporting your income to the government and so on. But the issue we ran into after a while is, in the beginning, we personally knew, or Nelson and David personally knew, the people who were contacting us and could vouch for them and say, oh, yeah, these are great guys. You know, they're going to do well by their clients. Don't worry about it. But after a while, sometimes we would get email from people saying, oh, I got your book, love it. I got a crowd here. Go fly you guys out. You're free next month. And we didn't know who these people were. And we didn't know. We'd get up there, basically sell the crowd on the virtues of this thing, and then leave. And then they would presumably be followed up with by the person who had hosted us and flew us out there. But we didn't know what he was doing with those people and whether it was actually living up to the sorts of policies that Nelson Nash, you know, in his mind, is what it should be done. So that is why, among other reasons, we founded the IBC Practitioners Program. So this is a course, and I'm just introducing the idea to you. Nelson and Carlos will talk more about it, and then David Stearns actually is. David, do you want to just raise your hand just so everyone knows who you are? So David's up here. He's the guy that, you know, really knows all the fine details, running the program on a day-to-day basis. You know, talk to him if you want to know more of the nuances. But this program is, we designed it, interviewed a bunch of actuaries from home offices and stuff. As an economist, I wanted to make sure I really understood the product. So we're teaching the theory of IBC, if you will, at the level of financial professional, right? So Nelson's book was for the general public. You would not be able to responsibly implement IBC or privatized banking with your own clients if all you had ever done was read Nelson's book, all right? And so that's what the purpose of this was, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. Yeah, so benefits of the Practitioners Program. It, again, provides actuarially sound explanation of what's going on in these dividend-paying whole life policies. And I think I sort of explain it as an economist, and so for some people it clicks and they say, okay, yeah, that makes sense in terms of like what is the surrender cash value, how do the loans work, what's going on under the hood. That's what we try to give you there. So not that you need to know that to tell a client per se, but it's important you understand it up here so that when you put it in language the client understands, you don't make a simplification that's actually not quite right. Another important thing, as Mark Benson said, these need to be specially designed, right? That it's not enough just to get a dividend-paying whole life policy. If what you want to use it for is to maximize cash value growth and use it as cash flow management, there's ways with riders and things like that that you would use to make sure it performs optimally. And so this is partly what we teach in the program. It's not just about life insurance. There's also a primer, if you will, on economics, specifically with the aim of money in banking and life insurance. And it gives you a free Laura Murphy Report subscription. So the Laura Murphy Report is a monthly publication that Carlos and I put out. His name's Carlos Lara. Put out, and it just focuses on the issues of the day, and it gives articles that are in-depth on financial matters, particularly pertaining to life insurance and banking, because that's sort of our niche right now in this market. Okay, as far as the mechanics of the program, initially there's an interview process where we see, okay, you want to join our program, so we make sure the right kind of person gets in. After you take the course, there's online videos and a manual. There's a copy of the manual here if you want to look at it. And then there's a test at the end, to make sure you understand this stuff before you get into our program. And then depending on the person, and we would tell you this up front, depending on your experience, we would say either, yeah, if you pass the test, you're fine, you're in, or we might say, okay, given that you're new to this area or you've never sold a whole life policy or one that's designed in this way, if you pass the academic portion, then we're going to insist that you mentor with somebody who's already in our program that we know is a veteran in this. And then, when that person signs off, then you're fully in. So, but you would know that up front whether that was going to be a requirement. So the point of all that is to make sure what we're trying to do is build up an elite, qualified group of financial professionals that we can say to the public, these people have been trained to design these things to fulfill what Nelson Nash's vision was. We're not saying other people outside our program are bad. We're just saying we can't vouch for them. We don't know what they're doing. We can say if you are into this stuff, these people who've been through our program, if you read Nelson's book and say, I want one of these, where do I go? That the people who've been through this program definitely will be able to deliver that. And so as far as facilitating that interaction with the public, we have a list on our website for people who want to be listed there and say they're graduates of the program. And then the other benefit is the IBC think tank that's annually in Birmingham. We've restricted that now to people who've been to the program, so that way, people can talk, shop, and share strategies among other people who are authorized practitioners. Okay, so very quickly here, I'm running out of time. I need to turn it back to John. Why are we focusing on the so-called Austrian economics? That term, if you've never heard it, it's not that we study the GDP of Vienna. What it means is that's just the historical label where the founders of the school happen to be from Austria, right? It would be weird if they were from Czechoslovakia, but no, they're from Austria. And so that's why it's called Austrian economics, the name just stuck, all right? But again, it's very free market, but it's not simply it's not an ideological thing. They analyze things from the individual level. They don't use a bunch of equations and math, not because they're afraid of the math, but because they don't think that's the right way to analyze human behavior in terms of economics. I think it's more important to understand logically how does the economy work. And in particular, again, for a financial crowd, we think people who are meeting with clients talking about their money, if you don't know economic theory, how can you be doing a good job with them? Let me just show you one example of the kind of thing we cover, certainly in the Laura Murphy report, if you're getting that. And if you want to see some samples of that, talk to David, and he can get your email and send you some samples if you want to see what we're talking about. But just to show you, for example, so this is something that for years I had been showing crowds, and even people in the financial services industry, a lot of them weren't aware of this. So just so you understand what this chart is showing, the blue line is the S&P 500 index, the black line is basically the Fed's balance sheet. It's the total assets held by Federal Reserve banks. So with the various rounds so you can see the black line here, in the late 2008, it shoots way up. All right, and so here, this is billions. So the Fed was holding about, 700 billion or so in assets, and then all of a sudden it shoots way up. And then, oops, sorry, that's the index. It's over here. Yeah, so it's a little over $700, $800 billion in assets, and then it shoots way up very quickly, so more than doubled in just a few months. And then it's tapered up, and then here's, the QE, and then here's the QE3, and then it tapered off, all right? And so just look at the blue lines, the S&P 500 index. You can just see since 2009 how these things have moved in tandem. And so that's why we were, again, it's not that we're saying, because the stock market's overvalued, therefore you should get one of these Nelson-Nash policies. We were just saying these Nelson-Nash policies make sense in any environment, but particularly, do you really want to be socking all your money into the stock market, your 401k, given these things that look at the policies they put in place since 2009, do you think that's really boosting the future productivity of the U.S. economy? Does it make sense to you? The stock market's booming in light of all these changes they're making. And a lot of people would say, no, that doesn't really make sense. And so I'd show them this and say, well, it's because they're just pumping money in. That's what's putting it up. Now, beyond just this raw correlation, you can also see every time that the stock market dropped significantly was when they had been, the rounds of QE expansion had stopped. So you can see here, the black line leveled off, and that's when the S&P fell. And if you remember back in terms of real time, when the Fed would explain why were they doing another round of QE, one of the things they would say is they would point at the stock market and say, oh, that's an indicator of what the market thinks about the economy in the future. And so, again, it's not just a mere correlation. I think there's definitely causation here that the stock market started dipping down, and then the Fed said, oh, we're going to pump in another $1 trillion or whatever the number was, and all of a sudden the stock market starts rising again. And you can see same thing here. Again, look at when this round of QE ended, look how much the market fell. And then same thing there. When that taper finally kicked in, you see the market fell. And then even this so this was what happened in August and September. And even there, you could say, well, the Fed's balance sheet didn't go down. It's true, but this is when the market thought in September there was going to be the first rate hike. And so in August, that's when all hell broke loose in the U.S. stock market, and they postponed it. So we can, here I'm just showing you a chart, just giving you a vague story. If you read our book or start reading the Laura Murphy report, or better yet, join our course and get the instruction, you can understand more specifically how does the Austrian school explain the business cycle. And so just very quickly, the Austrians, Ludwig von Mises in particular, he developed a theory of the business cycle that said it's because of artificially low interest rates. That artificially low interest rates cause a boom, but that doesn't create real savings. And then when the Fed finally chickens out and lets interest rates rise, that's when the crash happens. And so the Keynesian school, the people on CNBC, everybody, when the bottom falls out, unemployment shoots up, they just look at that and they say, oh, well, how come the economy's bad? How come people aren't spending? And they try to jumpstart the economy and make everyone think it's Christmas and just start spending money like that's going to solve the problem. When the Austrians say, no, the problem is the preceding boom, that's where the mistakes were made. People started all these investment projects that couldn't be completed, and so you need to nip that in the bud. You don't need to deal with the economy. Once the crash happens, that's reality reasserting itself. All right, so that's a very contrarian perspective, and so I think at the very least it would be helpful to you to be aware of that perspective. Okay, last thing I'll talk about and turn over to John is, why are we here? Why are we at this particular conference? Well, Mark and John and Robbie and a bunch of the other of their staff have gone through our program. As Mark mentioned, they've been using this in their own practice, so they're authorized practitioners. But beyond that, we just really like their philosophy. We feel very comfortable telling our new people when they're wondering, who do I go to for mentorship? If I want to emulate somebody, we're very comfortable saying, look at what those guys in St. Louis are doing. We're confident that their clients are being educated properly and they're not going to be confused by what they end up getting down the road. And I think for me, partly why I enjoy them so much is because of their background in education. So that's because that's where I'm coming from. I mean, typically when I go to these conferences with a bunch of life insurance salespeople, I'll be there for 3 days and realize I've said 3 words, right? Because I'm not a salesperson, just at lunch. So you guys don't realize how much you talk, all right? That's what I want to. And so I can tell the difference between being with educate, and it's just a difference. They were mentioning, their third chair thing and how long they train people before they let them loose on their potential clients. So, we were absorbing all that and really appreciated that, because what they're doing here is definitely a different approach. And it's the kind of thing where I think a lot of people would look at that and say, well, yeah, we could do that, but that would take 3 years to get traction. We need results now. But to be successful and have long-term success, clearly you want to be doing things that pay off in the long term and not in the short term. And that's very compatible with Nelson's vision, as you're going to find out in a minute. Okay, so thanks for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to John.